They wore $1 million worth of diamonds around my neck just to mask the smell of the cage they'd built for me. I'm Dahlia Menendez, and on my 27th birthday, my parents didn't throw me a party. They held a public execution. They called me a madwoman, a thief, a shadow, but they forget that shadows can't be buried. Long before the ballroom went dark and the federal agents arrived, the nightmare began with a sound I knew by heart. The iron gates of the Menendez estate groaned with a familiar, heavy reluctance as they parted, a sound that always seemed to echo the internal resistance I felt whenever I returned to Lake Forest. Outside the silver-rimmed windows of my car, a thick October fog rolled off Lake Michigan, swallowing the manicured lawns and the century-old oaks until the world felt like a charcoal sketch. It was a beautiful, suffocating sight. This was the place where I was raised, yet as I drove up the winding driveway, I felt less like a daughter coming home, and more like a ghost haunting the corridors of my own past. As the youngest daughter in a family like the Menendez, I felt like an exile. Some sought solace in the quiet of the library, while my older sister, Isabella, found refuge in the flash of the camera. I was the one who got into Stanford, built D-Tech from scratch, and worked 16-hour shifts to prove I wasn't just a last-minute addition to the family. But in this house, achievement is often taken for granted, and silence is misinterpreted as absence. Have you ever felt like you were shouting from the bottom of a well, only to realize the people up there aren't even looking down? I pulled the car to a stop near the side entrance. Old Silas, the groundskeeper who had seen me through every scraped knee in graduation, was standing near the stone shed, his shoulders hunched against the damp chill. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin, and walked over to him. I didn't care about my silk dress or the expensive heels sinking into the damp earth. I handed him the thermos I'd kept in the cup holder. He looked at me with eyes clouded by age but sharp with recognition. "You're back, Miss Dahlia," he whispered. I squeezed his hand, the rough texture of his skin a grounding contrast to the artificiality waiting for me inside. "It's good to see you, Silas. Drink this before the fog gets into your bones," I said softly. I watched him take a sip, a small spark of warmth returning to his face. Character isn't something you display under the crystal chandeliers of a ballroom. It's something you carry in the quiet moments when no one is around to applaud. My parents, Ridgway and Casey, never understood that. To them, Silas was part of the landscape. To me, he was the only honest thing left in this zip code. I took a deep breath, adjusted the hem of my black silk dress, and headed toward the main doors. The transition from the misty silence of the garden to the grand ballroom was like a physical blow. The air inside was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic edge of expensive perfume. Crystal glasses clinked in a rhythmic, aggressive symphony. I had barely stepped onto the marble floor when my mother, Casey, glided toward me. Her smile was perfect, the kind of perfection that requires a surgeon's touch and a total lack of sincerity. Behind her stood my father, Ridgway, looking every bit the corporate titan in a custom tuxedo that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Dahlia, darling, you're finally here," Casey cooed, her hands fluttering near my shoulders without actually touching me. It was the uncharacteristic affection that made my skin crawl. "Look at you. So simple. I suppose that tech lifestyle doesn't leave much room for style, does it?" I met her gaze, keeping my expression as neutral as the Chicago winter. "I've learned that the most expensive things in life aren't worn, Mom. They are lived," I replied. I saw the slight tightening of her jaw, the only sign that my words had landed. Ridgway didn't waste time with small talk. He took my elbow with a grip that felt more like an escort to a deposition than a fatherly gesture. He led me toward the center of the room where the who's who of Chicago's elite stood in tight, judgmental circles. My eyes immediately found my grandfather, Menendez, sitting in his high-backed leather chair near the fireplace. He was the sun around which this dark planet orbited. He didn't wave or smile. He simply watched, his eyes two chips of blue ice that seemed to see through the tuxedos and the silk straight to the rot beneath. Isabella was already there, draped in a couture gown that screamed for attention, her laughter ringing out a bit too loudly as she entertained a group of investors. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my modest attire with a condescending pity that she didn't bother to hide. She was the golden child, the one who treated every family gathering like a press release for her own ego. I stood my ground, focusing on the weight of the old watch on my wrist, the one grandfather gave me years ago. It was a reminder that time eventually exposes everyone. "Attention, everyone!" Ridgway's voice boomed, silencing the room with practiced authority. He raised a vintage champagne flute, his chest swelling with the importance of the moment. "Tonight, we celebrate the 27th year of our youngest, Dahlia. She's been off building her little empire, but it's time she truly came home to the Menendez fold." He signaled to a waiter who stepped forward carrying a velvet box. The room held its breath as Ridgway flipped the lid, revealing a diamond necklace that captured the light and shattered it into 1,000 jagged pieces. The gasps from the guests were immediate. It was a $1 million statement of love. Ridgway draped the cold stones around my neck, his fingers lingering near my pulse. "This is for your official ascension into the inner circle," he announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "A sign that from this night forward, your interests and the family's interests are one and the same, under a unified management for the protection of our legacy." A surge of warmth hit my chest. For one foolish, fleeting second, I allowed myself to believe that the war was over. I thought the work I'd done had finally bought me a seat at the table. I looked at Grandfather Menendez, hoping to see a reflection of my joy in his face. But he wasn't looking at the diamonds. He wasn't looking at the crowd. His gaze was fixed on the legal documents sitting on a small side table next to my father's discarded jacket. For a split second, our eyes met. He didn't nod. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand and tapped the face of his pocket watch twice. It was a gesture so subtle that only I saw it. A warning. The diamonds felt heavy against my collarbone, their weight suddenly shifting from a gift to a tether. I felt the coldness of the stones seeping into my skin, and the deceptive calm of the room began to feel like the eye of a hurricane. The air in the grand ballroom, once humming with the polite vibration of celebration, suddenly curdled. I stood center stage, the $1 million diamond necklace feeling like a cold, jagged collar of ice against my throat. The transition was so abrupt it felt like a physical blow. One second, I was the celebrated daughter. The next, the lights dipped into a predatory dimness. The overhead projectors, meant to display a retrospective of my 27 years, flickered to life with a violent hum. But there were no baby photos, no graduation memories. Instead, the high-definition screen erupted into a crimson tide of financial spreadsheets, offshore bank routing numbers, and internal audit red flags. My father, Ridgway, stepped back from me, his face transforming from a mask of paternal pride into a sculpture of righteous fury. "Dahlia," he began, his voice amplified by the room's surround sound system until it shook the very crystal in the guests' hands. "I wanted tonight to be about family, but I cannot ignore the rot you've brought into this house." He gestured broadly to the screen. $25 million, embezzled, funneled through D-Tech into shell companies in the Caymans. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? The room went deathly silent. I felt the collective weight of 75 elite Chicagoan gazes pivoting toward me. Eyes that had been smiling seconds ago now narrowing with the thrill of a public execution. I caught sight of Isabella near the buffet. She wasn't shocked. She had her phone out, the red recording light blinking like a hungry eye. She was live streaming this. My humiliation was being packaged into content before I could even draw a breath. It's funny how the people who claim to love you the most are often the first to record your fall. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and realized that not a single one of them is on your side? The leaked documents on the screen were a masterclass in forgery. But as an ICU nurse and a tech founder, I was trained to look for the minute error in a crisis. My mind, despite the roaring in my ears, began to scan the data. There. A routing prefix for a bank in Vermont that didn't exist in the year listed. A clerical error in a federal tax code reference. Ridgway had been thorough, but he was arrogant. He assumed I would panic. He assumed I was too weak to fight. I drew a slow, steady breath, recalling a stoic truth my grandfather once whispered. The louder the accusation, the thinner the evidence. Truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. I kept my hands at my sides, refusing to let them see me shake. Just as I opened my mouth to address the blatant inaccuracies, my mother, Casey, stepped forward. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She did something far more lethal. She began to cry, the soft, practiced sobs of a mother mourning a lost soul. "It's the illness, Ridgway," she whimpered, her voice carrying perfectly to the back of the hall. "We tried to hide it. We tried to protect her. Dahlia hasn't been herself for months. The hallucinations, the delusions of grandeur about her tech empire. She's sick." Before I could process the shift, a man in a sharp gray suit stepped out from the shadows of the library annex. Dr. Sterling. I recognized him as a high-priced consultant my parents had been seeing, but Casey introduced him as my private physician. He held up a thick manila folder, his expression one of professional pity. "Miss Menendez has been under my care for an acute schizophrenic break," he lied, his voice as smooth as oil. The embezzlement was a byproduct of her manic state. These prescriptions, he flicked through a list of heavy-duty sedatives I had never touched, were found in her nightstand this morning. She's a danger to herself and the company. Casey produced a pen and a set of documents with a flourish of silk. "Dahlia, honey, sign these. It's a voluntary admission form for the facility in Switzerland, and a temporary share transfer deed to Isabella so the company can recover while you get better. It's an act of love, sweetheart. We just want to save you from jail." I looked around the room. I saw my mentors, my colleagues, my friends. They weren't looking for the truth. They were nodding in agreement. They found it easier to believe I was crazy than to believe my parents were monsters. A woman's sanity is often the first thing a man tries to steal when he can't steal her spirit. The air in the ballroom felt like it was being sucked out of the room. I was being gaslit on a global stage. The legal trap was clear. Under Illinois probate law, if I signed those papers, I was admitting to mental incompetence. I would lose my voting rights, my 15% stake in D-Tech, and my literal freedom. I would become a ward of Ridgway, a ghost owned by the man who wanted to erase me. I looked at Grandfather Menendez. He sat like a stone gargoyle, his blue eyes fixed not on me, but on the forged medical report. He was a shark who knew the scent of blood, and right now he was watching to see if I would sink or swim. Ridgway leaned in, the scent of expensive scotch and malice radiating from him. He placed a heavy fountain pen in my hand, his fingers crushing mine. "You have 60 seconds, Dahlia," he hissed, his voice a serrated blade. "Sign the transfer and the commitment. Or I call the CPD. I have the evidence. I have the witnesses. You'll be in a cell by midnight. Think of the Menendez name. Don't be a martyr for a lost cause." He smirked, a predatory glint in his eyes as he looked toward the security detail at the doors. I looked down at the pen. My heart was a hammer against my ribs, but my ICU training took over. In a code blue, you don't panic, you prioritize. I felt the cold weight of the diamond necklace, the tether they thought would hold me. I looked at the pen, then back at my father. I didn't see a giant. I saw a man so desperate to cover his own debts that he was willing to lobotomize his own daughter's future. I slowly, deliberately placed the pen back on the table. My hand didn't tremble. Not even a little. "I'm not signing anything, Ridgway," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "And if you want an evaluation, we'll do it with a board-certified independent auditor and a court-appointed psychologist. Not your paid actors." The smirk slid off his face. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, the distant, mournful wail of sirens began to bleed through the heavy oak doors. Ridgway's eyes darkened, a triumphant sneer returning. He hadn't just prepared a trap. He had prepared a finale. He signaled the security team, and I heard the heavy thud of the ballroom bolts sliding into place. "I gave you a choice, Dahlia," he whispered, stepping back as the sirens grew louder, a mechanical scream that tore through the refined atmosphere. But some children only learn the hard way. I realized then that I wasn't just at a party. I was at the edge of a vanishing. The mechanical scream of the sirens outside seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones, a herald of the vanishing my father had so carefully choreographed. Before I could even process the weight of the security detail closing in, a hand clamped firmly around my upper arm. It wasn't the rough grip of a guard, but the slender, manicured fingers of my sister. Isabella leaned into my space, her perfume, a cloying, expensive jasmine, acting as a secondary suffocation. "Come with me, Dahlia," she whispered, her voice a perfect imitation of a concerned sibling. "Before you make a scene that even Grandpa can't fix." She pulled me toward a dimly lit corridor, away from the judgmental glare of the ballroom, and into a secluded alcove overlooking the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. For a moment, we stood in the shadows. Isabella reached up, her touch clinical and devoid of any sisterly warmth, as she began to fuss with a stray strand of my hair. "You look a mess," she murmured, her eyes scanning the grand hall through the glass. "But don't worry. Everyone already believes the doctor. They want to believe it. It's cleaner that way." I looked at her reflection in the darkened window. This was the person I had shared a nursery with. We had played with the same dolls and whispered secrets under the same silk sheets. Now she was a stranger wearing a mask of false empathy. I saw the truth then. My parents had provided the fuel for this fire, but Isabella had provided the spark. She was the one who had spent months whispering in the ears of the board members, planting the seeds of hallucinations and instability long before tonight began. I felt a profound, hollow sadness. The deepest wounds aren't made by enemies, but by the hands we once held for comfort. Isabella leaned closer, her voice dropping the facade, revealing the predator beneath. "Did you really think you were the smart one, Dahlia?" she hissed. "The little Stanford prodigy with her tech startup? You were always just a placeholder." She reached up, her fingers deft and practiced, and unclasped the $1,000,000 diamond necklace from my throat. I didn't resist. I let the cold stones fall into her palm. "Bipolar girls shouldn't handle assets this heavy," she sneered. "It's too much for your fragile mind." The cruelty was so casual it felt insane. Isabella tossed the necklace into her clutch as if it were a common trinket. She informed me, with a chilling lack of remorse, that Ridgway had already promised her my 15% stake in D-Tech as a reward for securing my voluntary commitment. To her, my life, my sanity, and my hard-earned success were merely commodities to be traded for a higher seat in the corporate boardroom. She didn't hate me. She simply found me inconvenient to her assent. I stood in the silence of the alcove, watching her gloat. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply looked at her, seeing the rot that had taken hold of her soul. "You think you're gaining a fortune, Isabella," I said, my voice barely a whisper yet steady enough to make her flinch. "But you're only inheriting a debt of conscience that no bank can ever clear. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when the people you've betrayed will do the same to you." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes, and walked away, the diamonds in her bag catching the dying light of the ballroom. I was left alone in the shadows, the silence of the corridor pressing in on me like a physical weight. My hand instinctively went to my wrist, my fingers brushing the scratched metal of the old watch Grandfather had given me. In a room full of thieves, the only thing they can't steal is the truth you hold in your head. His voice echoed in my mind, a phantom anchor in the rising tide of my family's greed. I looked down at the medical documents Isabella had carelessly left on the stone ledge. My ICU-trained eyes, accustomed to reading charts in the dim light of a crisis, caught a small, glaring detail. The timestamp at the bottom of the psychiatric report. It was dated 4 hours ago, printed from a secure server Isabella shouldn't have been able to access without my personal biometric key, unless she had been skimming my data for weeks. It was a mistake, a small technical oversight in their rush to bury me. That tiny string of numbers became my anchor of hope. I wasn't a victim of madness, I was the target of a documented crime. My brain, once clouded by the shock of betrayal, began to calculate with the cold precision of a software engineer. Isabella wanted my shares, and Ridgway wanted my silence, but they had left a digital footprint in their haste. I stood up, smoothing the silk of my dress, the phantom weight of the diamonds finally gone. I didn't need their love to survive this night. I only needed their own arrogance to become their undoing. I stepped out of the shadows and back into the light of the ballroom. The guests were still there, huddled in their circles of gossip, watching for the final act of my destruction. I ignored the security guards and walked straight toward the high-backed leather chair where Grandfather Menendez sat. He was still watching, his blue eyes as unreadable as the lake. I wasn't looking for a savior anymore. I was a successor returning to the board, and I had a report that was about to change the entire valuation of the Menendez name. The sirens outside finally cut to a chilling silence, leaving the grand ballroom of the Menendez estate under a weight so heavy it felt as if the oxygen had been sucked from the room. I walked back into the center of the hall, my heels clicking against the marble with a rhythmic precision that betrayed none of the storm raging beneath my skin. The security guards shifted, their hands hovering near their belts, but they hesitated. There was something in my gaze, a cold, analytical clarity, that made them step back. I wasn't the frantic girl they expected to break. I was a professional entering a trauma bay, and I had just identified the source of the bleeding. I stood directly before my grandfather, ignoring the predatory smirk on my father's face and the theatrical weeping of my mother. I didn't come to him as a granddaughter begging for a crumb of mercy or a child seeking protection. I stood there as a majority stakeholder of D-Tech, ready to present a final audit. Integrity isn't about being liked by the people in this room. It's about having the courage to stand by the truth when the whole world is convinced you're the villain. This was a lesson I'd seen in the eyes of every great leader I admired, and tonight, I was going to embody it. I looked up at the projection screen where my alleged failures were still glowing in jagged red lines. To the untrained eye, it was a catastrophe. But my ICU-trained brain was built to find patterns in chaos. I saw it again, the recurring numerical string in the metadata of the embezzlement logs. It was a sequence I knew, a ghost from my past. My grandfather once taught me that a lie is a house built on sand, but a number is a footprint that never washes away. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out my tablet, my fingers moving with a speed that Isabella's recording phone couldn't hope to match. The silence grew more suffocating as I pulled up a public document that my parents never expected me to check. The IRS Form 990 filings for the Menendez Family Charity. In the United States, transparency isn't just a suggestion for nonprofits, it's a legal mandate. I cross-referenced the transaction IDs of my supposed business losses with the anonymous donations credited to my mother's charity fund over the last 6 months. It was a perfect mirror image match. The $25 million hadn't vanished into my pocket. It had been laundered directly into the charity Casey controlled to pay off the interest on Ridgway's failed New York real estate gambles. A profound, hollow sadness settled in my gut, sharper than any anger. They didn't just want to steal my shares. They had used my life's work, my sweat, and my reputation as a human shield for their own financial crimes. I turned my head slowly to look at Casey. She was still holding that silk handkerchief to her eyes, playing the role of the grieving mother. "Kindness is the highest form of intelligence, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "I only wish you hadn't used the mask of charity to hide the heart of a thief. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed every person that fund was supposed to help." Casey's hand froze. The crying stopped instantly, her face hardening into something sharp and ugly. But I didn't wait for her response. I hit send on a blind carbon copy of the encrypted evidence, routing it to an independent federal auditor I had placed on retainer months ago as a routine safety measure for D-Tech. I always knew this family was capable of greed, but I never expected them to be this sloppy. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they forgot I built my company on the very data security they were now trying to circumvent. Ridgway, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped toward me, his face a mask of purple-hued rage. He interpreted my grandfather's continued silence as a sign of senility, or, better yet, consent. He became louder, his voice booming with a desperate kind of authority as he shoved the transfer papers toward me again. "Dahlia, look at your grandfather. He can't even speak. He's disgusted by you. Sign the papers and end this circus before I have the guards drag you to the police station myself." He mocked me, sneering that even the patriarch had abandoned his favorite. I didn't look at the guards. I didn't look at the papers. I looked at Menendez's hand. It was resting on the arm of his leather chair, perfectly still. It wasn't the stillness of an old man who had lost his way. It was the stillness of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My grandfather wasn't silent because he was fooled. He was silent because he was waiting for me to finish my own battle. He was testing my quiet power, watching to see if I had the stomach to endure the slander until the trap was fully sprung. "I'm not signing your lies, Ridgway," I said, placing my hands behind my back and standing as tall as my heels would allow. I looked him directly in the eye, a gaze that told him I had seen every cent of the $25 million move through his wife's charity accounts. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive lightning strike. Ridgway's bravado began to flicker, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his eyes as he realized I wasn't backing down. He was a man who relied on fear to govern, and he had finally met someone who had outgrown it. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a deadlocked struggle between my father's desperate noise and my own resolute silence. Then the sound of crystal clinking against mahogany echoed like a gunshot through the ballroom. Grandfather Menendez had reached for his glass. He didn't drink. He simply set it down with a finality that signaled the end of the intermission. The entire room held its breath. My grandfather's eyes finally met mine, and in those icy blue depths I saw a spark I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't a look of pity for a granddaughter who needed saving. It was the recognition of a successor who had finally learned how to fight. The air in the ballroom had grown thin, vibrating with a high-pressure intensity that made every breath feel like a struggle. My grandfather's silent recognition had provided a brief, shimmering moment of hope, but I had underestimated the sheer, desperate velocity of a man with his back against the wall. Ridgway, sensing that I was gaining the intellectual high ground, didn't retreat. Instead, he signaled the tech booth with a sharp, jagged motion of his hand. The screen behind me flickered again, but this time, the cold spreadsheets vanished. In their place was a video. It showed a woman who looked exactly like me, her face captured in the flickering neon of an underground Atlantic City casino. The digital Dahlia was laughing, tossing high-value chips onto a craps table with a reckless, manic energy I had never possessed. It was a masterclass in AI deepfake technology, seamless, terrifying, and devastatingly effective. This was a direct strike at the moral turpitude clause in my executive contract, a legal poison pill designed to strip me of my standing before I could even open my mouth to explain. I stood remarkably still, watching my own image desecrated on the screen. Behind me, I heard the sharp rhythmic sound of Isabella's heels. She moved toward me with a look of staged horror, and as she passed, she accidentally knocked my clutch from the table. The bag hit the marble and a small clear plastic satchel of blue pills spilled out, skittering across the floor like cursed marbles. Counterfeit prescriptions. Another layer of the tableau. They weren't just calling me a thief, they were painting me as a degenerate lost to addiction and greed. A man who relies on a lie to win has already admitted he is too weak to face the truth. I looked at Ridgway, and for the first time I felt a deep, chilling pity for the man who used to be my hero. "Enough of this circus!" Ridgway's voice tore through the room, heavy and suffocating. He slammed a new stack of documents onto the mahogany table. These weren't audit reports. They were an immediate resignation and a total transfer of all D-Tech intellectual property to the Menendez Global Parent Company. 60 seconds, Dahlia," he hissed, his eyes dark with a frantic, predatory hunger. "You sign these and you go quietly to the medical facility Silas has prepped in Switzerland. Or I hit dial, and the Chicago police come in to process you for the embezzlement and the narcotics I just found." 4 men in dark blazers moved out from the library annex, their faces as hard as the stone statues in the foyer. Private security. Former state troopers Ridgway had hired to escort me. The room felt like a cage I had built with my own hands. Casey stepped closer, her perfume cloying and suffocating as she reached for my hand. "It's your last chance for mercy, Dahlia," she whispered, her voice a weaponized version of maternal concern. "Sign the papers. Don't let your grandfather see you in handcuffs. Just let us take care of you." They were leveraging the very bond of family to force a pen into my hand, using love as a crowbar to pry away my soul. The ticking of the large digital clock on the wall felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. I looked at the pen, a heavy, gold-plated instrument of my own erasure. I looked at the security guards, their presence a cold promise of the vanishing Ridgway had planned. I knew then that my father was willing to lobotomize my entire future, to bury me in a drugged haze in a distant clinic, just to cover the gambling debts he had incurred in his own arrogance. It was a betrayal so absolute it transcended anger. Have you ever looked at someone who raised you and realized they never actually saw you at all? I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I stood as tall as the high-stakes pressure allowed, my posture reflecting the quiet power of a woman who had finally found her limits. I offered one final moment of grace to the man who was trying to destroy me. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension with a calm that made the security guards hesitate. "I would have helped you if you had simply asked. I would have used D-Tech's reserves to bail you out of your New York failures. You didn't need to kill the daughter who loved you just to save a penthouse you don't even own anymore." Ridgway's face went a shade of purple I had only seen in the ICU during a cardiac arrest. The arrogance flickered for a second, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He knew I had seen the shell companies. He knew I had the metadata, but the timer on the screen was hit 0 with a cold digital beep. He didn't hesitate. The man I once called father looked at the security guards and gave a sharp, downward nod. "Take her," he commanded, his voice cracking with the strain of his own lies. "She's clearly in the middle of a psychotic break. Escort her to the waiting car immediately." The lead guard's hand reached for my arm, his grip a cold promise of the cage my family had built for me. The guests in the room pulled back, their faces masks of pity and morbid curiosity, watching the youngest daughter be led away to her own vanishing. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I simply looked past the guards, past my father, and directly at the one man in the room who still had the power to stop time itself. My grandfather Menendez reached for his whiskey glass, and the sound of it hitting the mahogany table again was like the first crack of a winter frost on a deep, dark lake. The lead security guard's hand was inches from my arm, a physical threat intended to seal my fate, but he stopped as if he had hit an invisible wall. The crystal shards of my grandfather's whiskey glass lay scattered across the mahogany table, glittering like diamonds under the harsh ballroom lights. The sound of that impact, the heavy, intentional crack of glass on wood, had effectively stopped time. Grandfather Menendez stood up slowly. It was a simple movement, but the air in the room shifted instantly. The security team, Ridgway's hand-picked enforcers, retreated 2 steps, their professional bravado evaporating in the presence of the man who built the very foundation they stood upon. Menendez didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the crowd. He stood like a stone monolith, his presence alone carrying the weight of the law and the finality of a gavel. He had been silent for hours, a silence my father had foolishly mistaken for consent or senility. Now I understood that my grandfather had been the silent predator in the tall grass, waiting for the exact moment the sharks in the room fully exposed their teeth. I stood beside him, my posture unbroken, feeling the sudden, surging warmth of justice. Power doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest, I thought. It belongs to the one who holds the truth while everyone else is busy screaming lies. "Sit down, Ridgway," Menendez said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonant authority that made the room go deathly still. "This trial is now under my jurisdiction." My father went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Casey's theatrical weeping ceased as if a switch had been flipped, her eyes darting between her husband and the patriarch. The trap was no longer mine. It was his. And it was about to be sprung. My grandfather signaled his head of security, a man who had served him for 30 years. The 200-inch projection screen, which only moments ago had been flashing the deep fake video of my supposed addiction, suddenly went black. When it flickered back to life, the high-definition footage was different. It was a hidden camera feed from my father's private study dated just 3 nights ago. The room watched in a collective, horrified paralysis as the screen showed Ridgway and Casey clinking champagne flutes. Their voices were crystal clear, explicitly detailing the plan to institutionalize the brat, to cover the massive interest payments on Ridgway's secret $200 million offshore gambling debt. The betrayal was documented in agonizing detail. We saw Isabella on the tape, practicing her concerned sister face in front of a mirror, laughing as she rehearsed the speech about my supposed manic schizophrenic break. It was a premeditated corporate execution, caught in 4K resolution. I looked at Casey, seeing the woman who had helped me dress for my prom and held my hand during my first heartbreak. A heartbreaking pity washed over me. "You spent 27 years trying to make me feel small, Mom," I said softly, my voice cutting through the gasps of the guests. "But all you really did was show me exactly how far you'd sink to avoid looking in the mirror. You didn't just lose your daughter tonight. You lost yourself." The atmosphere in the room changed from a gala to a crime scene. Ridgway turned to the security guards, his voice a frantic, high-pitched screech. "Get them out! Turn it off! They're trespassing!" But the lead guard didn't move to assist him. Instead, the man reached into his jacket and produced a badge. The private security team Ridgway thought he had hired were actually undercover federal agents from the SEC and the FBI. My grandfather hadn't just been watching. He had been cooperating with a federal investigation for weeks. The invitation to Ridgway's enforcers had been intercepted and replaced by the patriarch himself. The handcuffs clicked shut around my father's wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the rafters. It was a sound of absolute karma. Ridgway was being processed for wire fraud and international money laundering. Beside him, Casey was taken into custody for the systemic embezzlement of the Menendez family charity funds. The very money she claimed was going to the underprivileged was actually fueling their delusions of grandeur. Have you ever seen the exact moment a lie collapses under its own weight? It's not loud. It's the sound of a house of cards falling in a vacuum. Menendez turned his gaze to the room, his eyes like blue lasers. "There will be a total erasure," he announced. His voice was a terminal sentence. "Ridgway and Casey are no longer permitted to carry the Menendez name. Their trust funds are dissolved. Their access to every company property is revoked permanently. They will leave this house in the custody of the United States government." It was the sovereign expulsion, a complete removal of their existence from the legacy they tried to steal. Isabella fell to her knees, the stolen diamond necklace clattering onto the marble floor. She reached for the stones as if they could somehow save her, her eyes wild and searching for a camera that was no longer sympathetic. I refused to look at her. I realized then that my quiet power had finally set me free. I wasn't the victim they wanted to bury. I was the architect of a new reality. As the federal agents led my parents toward the side exit, the heavy weight of the diamonds I no longer wore felt lighter than air. I understood that the only inheritance I ever truly needed was the one I carried in my soul, the integrity that no deepfake could ever erase. I stood in the center of the ballroom, the silence now clean and honest. The fog outside had turned into a full-scale Chicago storm, the rain lashing against the windows. But inside, the air was clear. I looked at the 27th birthday cake, still sitting untouched on the table, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The Pattersons, the people who had tried to define me by my instability, were gone. The transition from the chaos of the ballroom to the stillness of the executive suite felt like emerging from a deep, turbulent ocean into the crisp clarity of high altitude. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Menendez Global Headquarters, watching the Chicago skyline wake up. A thin, golden ribbon of light began to peel back the darkness over Lake Michigan, reflecting off the steel and glass with a brilliance that felt like a personal benediction. For the first time in my 27 years, the air in my lungs didn't feel borrowed. The Patterson name, and the instability they tried to anchor to my soul, had vanished with the morning tide. 1 week had passed since the gala. The legal reports on my desk were a testament to the terminal velocity of a fallen lie. Ridgway and Casey were currently being held without bail. The federal prosecutor had successfully argued that their vast network of offshore accounts made them a flight risk. Isabella, who once lived for the digital validation of strangers, had been thoroughly erased by the very social media world she worshipped. Her lifestyle brand had collapsed overnight as the live stream of her mocking my staged breakdown went viral for all the wrong reasons. The irony wasn't lost on me. She wanted to record my destruction only to broadcast her own. I had been asked several times if I wanted to visit them. I declined. It wasn't an act of hatred or a desire for revenge. It was a stoic realization that their path was no longer my burden to carry. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean inviting the fire back into your house just because you've survived the burn. It means realizing you no longer need the warmth of people who are willing to watch you turn to ash. However, I didn't want to become the monster they were. I instructed the legal team to set up a bare minimum trust to cover their basic living expenses once they eventually serve their time. Mercy, I realized, is the ultimate expression of power. It proves they can no longer touch you. The door to the suite opened with a soft, familiar click. Grandfather Menendez walked in, his footsteps steady on the thick carpet. He didn't offer a hug or a platitude. Instead, he placed a silver lighter and a small iron bowl on the mahogany desk. Next to it, he laid out the forged medical commitment papers and the $500,000 promissory note Ridgway had tried to force me to sign. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of those documents representing every lie, every gaslit evening, and every silent tear I had ever shed in that house. I picked up the psychiatric report, the one that labeled me hog-headed and delusional. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. Ridgway and Casey never truly owned my shares, and they certainly never owned my mind. They only owned the fear I had of losing their love, and once that fear was gone, their power evaporated like mist. I flicked the silver lighter. The flame was small, but it was hungry. I held the edge of the forged documents to the fire and watched as the lies began to curl and blacken. As the flames consumed the papers in the iron bowl, I thought of a sentiment that had kept me going during the darkest shifts in the ICU. The most powerful thing you can do is to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else. The weight of 27 years of being the difficult daughter, the unstable youngest, and the placeholder vanished into a thin wisp of gray smoke. I watched the ashes settle, feeling a profound internal healing. I wasn't just a survivor of a corporate ambush. I was the architect of my own identity. Grandfather Menendez reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the official seal of the CEO. He placed it on the desk between us. He didn't say it was a gift. He didn't say I was his favorite. He simply looked at me with those icy blue eyes and said, "You survived the stress test, Dahlia. Now build something that lasts." It was the only validation I ever truly needed. Not a reward for being compliant, but a recognition of being competent. I picked up the seal, its weight substantial and real, a physical manifestation of a sovereignty I had earned through fire. My first act as the head of the company wasn't a purge of staff or a rebranding of the logo. I sat down and began the paperwork to restructure the Menendez family charity. It would no longer be a laundromat for executive greed. Instead, I transformed it into a genuine advocacy group for victims of financial and domestic gaslighting, a place where people could find the legal and psychological resources to fight back when their own families tried to erase them. I recorded a brief video message for the D-Tech team, my voice steady and intelligent. I told them the company would now be built on radical transparency, because a legacy built on secrets is just a tomb waiting to be opened. I picked up my old, scratched watch from the desk, the only item from my past I chose to keep. I wound it carefully and set it to the current time, marking the first hour of my new life. The ghosts of the Patterson name and the shadows of the ballroom were gone. I walked out of the glass tower and into the crisp Chicago morning, the air tasting of ozone and freedom. I wasn't looking for a home in the eyes of people who didn't love me. I was the home. My heels clicked against the pavement with a rhythmic, quiet power as I walked toward a future I had written myself.